Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and record this in case I have to use it. Um, but hopefully I don't have to use it. Regardless, today's lesson will be about the Belgian Congo and a little bit more, going a little bit more in depth about African colonization and why we see throughout history that the African nations don't hold their own against the Europeans, right? The Europeans take over all of Africa with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia, although Liberia is actually an American colony. So uh, realistically, Ethiopia is the only African nation to remain independent. So, with that said, I'm just going to jump right in to this. All right. So, we've already looked at some maps in the last lecture, which I hope everyone has seen or at least looked at since I've uh, uploaded it onto Canvas, even if you weren't there for that. But as we have talked about a little bit, even before the scramble for Africa, right? This is 1830. This is well before. Europeans still had some land on the African continent, right? Mostly along the coast. And it was mostly just so they could buy slaves from the African nations, all right? So these kind of uh, tan colored areas would be African nations. This green, it would be the Arabs. All right, so this is the Ottomans right here and the Egyptians. And then obviously, if you read the key, blue is French, pink is British, and then we have some Spanish as well right there, right? So they all pretty much, all of the major powers had land along the coast, right? But they didn't really think to conquer any of the interior of Africa. And we talked about one of the main reasons for that is disease. Another reason for that is that they just don't know the land and there could be hostile people there. But the biggest one we talked about by far was disease, right? They called it the white man's death to enter the central regions of Africa because things like malaria, like we talked about in class before school got canceled, um, and other diseases would kill off a lot of the Europeans. But moving forward in history, right, we get to a point where the Europeans realize that there are a lot of natural resources in Africa, right? Africa is one of the most minerally rich and natural resource rich continents on the globe, right? It still is, even after all of the exploitation and all of the mining and farming done by the Europeans during the 19th century and 19th and 20th centuries. So you notice that as we go after the Berlin Conference, right? And just a quick reminder, that was just all the Europeans coming together in Berlin and discussing who owned what, right? So who was going to conquer what land. Uh, After the Berlin Conference, they start to conquer the land that they said they were going to conquer, right? Generally speaking, there's very little conflict between the Europeans. And then you get to here, right? This is 1914. This is what the continent looks like afterwards, all right? This is during World War One. And this map is just showing you all of this blue is owned by the Allied powers, all right? We're going to talk about that a little more when we actually get into World War One. But all of this is owned by the Allied powers. These little, I don't know what to call that color, I guess peach. Um, this is owned by Germany or the Central Powers. So all of these areas, with the exception of Ethiopia, like we talked about, Liberia, and these, but this is mostly desert. There's nothing here. That's why no one owns it. Are conquered. All right. So we go from a almost entirely free Africa with many different tribal powers and states. Ethiopia is actually a kingdom. A lot of these are kingdoms. Um, to a situation where Europeans own essentially everything. And the reason, one of the biggest reasons that that happens is because these African groups don't like each other. There's a lot of conflict between these African empires and kingdoms, and the Europeans play off of that. Okay, so the Europeans will go to one kingdom and say, "Hey, we're going to conquer we're going to conquer Bornu. Want to help us?" And they'll actually get the Africans to help them conquer that area, and then they'll turn around and they'll go over here, right? And they'll say, "You know what? We're going to conquer Darfur." Boom, they switch it around and they conquer that area. So there's a lot of internal conflict between the Africans, so they can't really join forces to fight off the Europeans. And two, the Europeans have, for the most part, superior technology. All right. Ethiopia is a little bit of a special case, and we've already talked about that, so I'm not going to get into it. All right. So moving on. If you watch the YouTube video and you saw my announcement, you know that we're going to talk a little bit about the Belgian Congo in particular. All right. It's a very unique case. All of these other areas are owned by nations. All right. And I know that sounds like something really stupid to say. Of course, they're owned by nations, their entire areas. But the Belgian Congo wasn't. The Belgian Congo was owned, at least for a very long time. It's called the Congo Free State, by the king. That's it. It was owned by a single man, and he had all of the power, got all of the money from selling the goods that were grown there, mostly rubber, and he was absolutely brutal. So let's talk about that a little bit. All right. We call that period of time in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It wasn't called that back then. It was called the Free State of Congo, right? Right here, Congo Free State. It was owned by King Leopold, right? And he decided that in order to maximize profits and to extract rubber in the best way, he would enslave almost the entirety of the population of the Congo, right? So he grows rubber. This is what rubber trees look like, by the way. And uh, Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the best regions to grow rubber trees, and one of the best regions to produce rubber. All right, the Belgian Congo even more so. So when King Leopold gets access to this nation through the Berlin Conference, they give it to him. He decides that he's going to ramp up rubber production because he knows that if we go up here and read a little bit, the rubber production is actually slowing down in Africa. So he knows that there's a hole in that market. And if he starts selling rubber, he could make a lot of money. So what he does is he changes everything in the country, right? He enslaves the people, and all males have to work on these rubber plantations, right? And we call this period the Rubber Terror because he's extremely violent, all right? This right here, all right? And really, this right here. So the exploitation of Congolese people as slave laborers to produce rubber caused the deaths of 10 million people in only a period of, what is that? 15 plus 8, that's 23. Only 23 years, and we lose 10 million people. Part of the reason was that, one, he didn't provide them with the means to feed themselves. All right. It's one of the most naturally and richest areas of the world in terms of natural resources, but he kept the Congolese people so poor that they didn't have the money to buy food to live. All right. So he was selling all of this rubber and keeping all the profits for himself because they were slaves. They didn't get paid, and he didn't really feed them or anything. All right. He uses, this is him, by the way. This is King Leopold. Um, we'll skip this part. He uses all of this land to grow the rubber, like we said, and you just kind of cut the tree and the rubber literally pours out. But his policy, sometimes called red rubber or the rubber terror, was extremely strict, like I said. You have a situation where all males have to work, all males and females, and even some children um, have to work. And if they don't meet quota, um, their hands would have to be cut off. All right, so you have, and if you look it up, you'll find it's many pictures taken by missionaries at the time who were disgusted at the brutality of the Belgian Congo. All right. So there, if you look it up, if you look up Belgian Congo, you will find pictures of Africans with no hands. You'll also find pictures of Africans with no hands or feet. All right. Because if a man didn't produce enough rubber, he would lose a hand. Sometimes, if he was a particularly good worker, but he didn't meet quota, they would actually go to his children and take their hands instead. Because the way it works for the military, and we'll talk about them in just a second, was that in order to get paid, they had to bring an equal number of hands that they said that they had killed or that they had punished. So if they came back to their officer and they said, oh, well, 20 people didn't meet quota today, in order to get paid for that, they would have to give the officer 20 hands. And there's pictures of buckets full of severed hands from this time. All right, so it's extremely disgusting, extremely brutal, and one of the, if not the worst systems of slavery to ever happen on this planet. Right. So that's why we talk about the Belgian Congo. And you have to remember, this is not a country. Belgium actually doesn't own this land. Only King Leopold owns this land. So the country of Belgium isn't actually benefiting in any way from this money. That's why if we go, well, you'll see here, the Democratic Republic of Congo still has a lot of issues because of this. A lot of the wealth that the Congo once had is gone. All right. And you actually have a lot of, some of these are actually child soldiers. Some of these are actually, rebels. You get, huge violent conflicts in the DRC, even to this day, right? The Democratic Republic of Congo. The economic and political development, it was slowed to a crawl, almost completely stopped in the country because of entire generations of men, women, children who died young due to disease, due to not having enough food, due to quite simply not having any feet or hands. Any number of cruelties could happen to them. So after Belgium leaves, there's an extremely unstable situation where there's a people who have been oppressed for so long, and then you just hand them freedom and they don't know what to do with it. So they're actually still dealing with the effects of this, right? With child soldiers, with, just a number of issues. But beside that, after the Congo Free State has been going on for a while, it only lasts about 28 years. But in that 28 years, what we said, 23, excuse me, we said that 10 million people lost their lives. That's a huge number. And it's considered one of the first large examples of a modern genocide, right? And a genocide is just a targeted killing of a certain people, all right? We'll talk more about that when we get to World War II and the Holocaust. So after a while, the Belgian government and a number of other countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, or Britain, it's Britain at the time, and even France start to realize that this is unacceptable, right? Slavery has been illegal in the rest of the world, including the United States, for decades, if not close to a century in Britain. So the European governments actually pressure King Leopold into giving up the land to the Belgian government. All right. So uh, after the rubber terror ends, so to speak, the Belgian Congo is no longer owned by King Leopold. It is owned by the Belgian government instead. Um, that didn't stop all of the issues, but by far, most of the cruelty ended when the Belgian government took over. All right. But of course, you still have lasting effects of that as entire families have been destroyed or crippled or both. All right. So that is the general gist of what we were going to go over today um, in this lecture, at least. I'm going to link both of these websites for you guys in an announcement, hopefully before class. I'll try and get that up. And there's also, a bunch of videos I've put up about these topics. I hope you, at the very least, watch the videos. There's also a number of readings that I've listed. So there's plenty of resources for you guys to really catch up on this topic. Um, and plenty of resources for you guys to go more in depth if you feel like it, especially for the Belgian Congo. The video will cover a lot of the things that I didn't have time to right now, but we should be good to go. So I will stop sharing and cool.